Hi, I am Sophie. I want to tell my story.
I grew up believing that family was a safety net, a constant shelter against the storms of life. For years, I trusted in that net, believing it would always hold me. My parents weren't wealthy, but they often reminded me of the sacrifices they had made for my future. Their words were laced with love, but also with a quiet pressure. Don't forget who gave you everything. I built my life on that foundation. Every decision, every career choice, every dream I allowed myself to chase, I did with their voices echoing in the background. When I finally saved enough to invest in my first small business, a cozy little cafe filled with books, warm light, and the smell of fresh coffee, I thought I was making them proud. They visited often, smiling at the customers, patting me on the back, telling everyone how proud they were of their daughter. But pride has a strange shadow. It wasn't long before the whispers started. My father would ask about the profits. My mother would hint at the money she had lent me years ago, the one I thought of as a gift. At first, I brushed it aside, grateful, eager to prove that I could repay them. But soon it grew into demands. Papers appeared, documents I had never signed, contracts with my name but not my handwriting. Suddenly, they claimed the cafe wasn't truly mine, that it was theirs. I remember the night it all collapsed. I was closing up, the golden lights reflecting in the windows, when two men in suits walked in. They carried legal papers, stamped and signed, declaring ownership of everything I had built. My name was there, in ink, twisted into agreements I never made. My parents had transferred my trust, my savings, even my lease, all into their hands. I froze. My chest felt like it was caving in as I read the words. My parents weren't victims of some scam. They were the architects of it. The betrayal cut deeper than any stranger could manage. This wasn't just theft of a business, it was theft of love, of years of devotion, of the belief that I belonged to something unshakable. The following weeks blurred. I moved out of the apartment I had been paying rent for, one that apparently they also owned under their name. I slept on a friend's couch, surrounded by boxes of books and half-packed memories. I avoided phone calls. I couldn't bear to hear their voices, the ones that once lulled me to sleep, now dripping with control. There were nights I cried until my throat burned, my tears soaking the pillow as my body curled into itself. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything I believed in and left me standing in the shell of a daughter who no longer existed. But in the silence of those nights, something stirred, a thought, a tiny ember. If family could betray me, if love could be twisted into chains, then maybe the only safety net I could trust was the one I built for myself. The ember didn't erase the pain, but it whispered of strength, of possibility, of a story not yet over. And though I didn't know it then, that ember would one day become a fire.
The days after losing my cafe felt like falling into an endless void. I woke up without a purpose, my hands itching to make coffee, to greet customers, to arrange books on the shelves. But those shelves no longer belonged to me. The place I had poured my soul into now bore my parents' name, a cruel reminder that even love could be rewritten in ink and signatures. I spent hours staring at walls, drifting between anger and despair. How could they? How could the people who raised me, who claimed every sacrifice was for my future, strip me of the one thing I had built for myself? The betrayal was more than financial. It was spiritual, a fracture that reached the deepest corners of who I was. My friends tried to console me. They invited me out, urged me to fight back in court, told me I had grounds for justice. But every time I thought of facing my parents in a courtroom, my stomach twisted. These were the people who tucked me in at night, who clapped at my school recitals, who told me stories about hard work and loyalty. Taking them to court felt like sawing off my own roots. So I withdrew. I told my friends I needed time, that I couldn't handle the noise of the world. I started wandering the city streets at night, headphones in, letting music drown out the storm inside me. The city was alive with neon lights, laughter spilling out of bars, couples holding hands. I felt invisible among them, a ghost moving through life, unnoticed and unwanted. One night, I passed by the cafe. Its warm glow still spilled onto the street, but it felt foreign now, like a house I once lived in but no longer had the key to. Through the window, I saw my parents sitting at one of the tables, laughing with strangers. My chest tightened, and I pressed myself against the brick wall, hiding in the shadows. That laughter, once a comfort, now sounded like knives scraping across glass. When I finally tore myself away, I walked until my legs ached. I found myself at the edge of the river, staring at the black water, reflecting the city lights. The night was cold, the wind biting against my cheeks, but I didn't move. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind. What if I disappeared? Not out of anger, not as revenge, just as an escape from the unbearable weight pressing down on me. Tears blurred the city skyline. My breath came in broken gasps, my body shaking as I sank onto the cold stone steps by the water. I whispered questions to the night. Why me? What did I do to deserve this? But the night gave no answers, only silence. And then a voice. Not from the dark, not from anyone nearby, but from inside me. Quiet, fragile, almost like a memory. It said, "They may have taken what you built, but they cannot take who you are." I froze. The words echoed in my chest, sparking against the hollow despair. My parents had stolen my cafe, my money, even my sense of belonging, but they hadn't destroyed me. They hadn't touched the part of me that created, that dreamed, that fought. That ember from before flared again, weak, but alive. I wiped my tears with trembling hands and forced myself to stand. My legs felt heavy, but I took a step. Then another. The city stretched out before me, wide and merciless, but also full of possibilities. I didn't know how or when, but I knew this. I wasn't finished. This was not the end of my story. The following weeks were a blur of fragile days and restless nights. I began to move again, though my steps were small. Each morning, I forced myself to leave the apartment, to feel the air, to prove to myself that I was still here. I carried a notebook wherever I went, filling its pages with thoughts, half-formed plans, and scattered dreams. Most of it made no sense, but writing gave me something to hold on to, a reminder that I hadn't been erased. I started spending time in the public library. It was quiet there, filled with strangers who didn't know my story, who didn't carry the weight of betrayal in their eyes. I sat by the tall windows, watching the light shift across the pages of borrowed books. I read about entrepreneurs who built empires from nothing, about people who rose again after losing everything.
Their words seeped into me like drops of water into dry soil. But healing wasn't linear. Some days I woke up determined, only to collapse into old despair by nightfall. I passed the cafe more than once, each time quickening my pace, my chest tightening at the thought of stepping inside. The laughter spilling out was a cruel reminder of what had been taken, and the faces of my parents, people I now saw less as family and more as strangers, haunted my every step. Still, there were sparks of life. One afternoon, I found myself sketching again. Not coffee menus or cafe plans, but rough outlines of a new idea. A small market stall. Nothing as permanent or demanding as a cafe, but something that could be mine. I imagined selling baked goods, handmade trinkets, perhaps even small notebooks with quotes that had helped me survive. It wasn't much, but it was a seed. But the doubts came crashing in. What if I failed again? What if people laughed? What if I wasn't strong enough? I carried those questions home like stones in my pockets. That night, unable to sleep, I stood in front of the mirror. My reflection was pale, my eyes ringed with exhaustion. For a long time, I stared, as though searching for the girl I used to be. And then I spoke out loud, surprising even myself. You are not finished. You are not broken beyond repair. The sound of my own voice startled me, but it felt real, like a declaration to the silence that had swallowed me for weeks. The very next morning, I took a leap. At the weekend market downtown, I walked between the rows of stalls, breathing in the scent of baked bread, coffee, and fresh flowers. My heart raced as I asked one of the organizers about renting a small space. The woman smiled warmly and handed me a flyer with details. My hands shook as I held it, but inside something shifted. For the first time since losing everything, I felt the faint thrum of possibility. It wasn't the cafe. It wasn't the life I once knew. But it was a beginning. One that belonged only to me. I left the market that day, with the flyer clutched tightly in my fist. The city around me looked different, brighter somehow, as though it was waiting for me to rise. This was my chance, and I was ready to take it. The flyer for the market stall stayed pinned to my fridge for days, like a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Each time I passed by it, my eyes lingered on the bold letters, "Applications now open." The word seemed to taunt me, daring me to believe I was capable of more than surviving. Fear wrestled with hope every morning. I'd make coffee, sit at the small kitchen table, and stare at my notebook, scribbling lists that ended in crossed outlines. What would I sell? How would I start? Was I foolish for even trying? The echo of my parents' betrayal still whispered in my mind. You're not enough. You'll never make it without us. One evening, while flipping through old recipes, my hand stopped on a stained page, a lemon cake I used to bake for neighborhood friends. The memory of laughter, of people savoring something I had created, sparked something inside me. That night, I baked again. My apartment filled with the warm scent of sugar and lemon zest, and for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel suffocating. I packed the cake into small slices, and the next morning, nervously shared it with my neighbors. To my surprise, their faces lit up. Compliments spilled out. "This is delicious, Sophie. Did you bake this? You should sell these." Their encouragement felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. Step by step, I began testing recipes. Cupcakes, cookies, small loaves of bread. My kitchen turned into a laboratory of trial and error. My counters covered in flour and sugar. Notebooks filled with adjustments and ideas. Not every attempt was perfect. Some trays ended in burnt edges or collapsed centers. But with each mistake, I felt more alive. The day I finally submitted the market stall application, my hand shook as I pressed send. A mix of terror and exhilaration coursed through me. When the confirmation email arrived, I stared at it for a long time, unable to believe this small victory was real. In the weeks that followed, I prepared obsessively. I designed simple packaging, handwritten labels, and even practiced conversations I might have with customers. The thought of standing behind a table, presenting something that came entirely from me, both thrilled and terrified me. The night before the market, I barely slept. My apartment was filled with boxes of baked goods stacked neatly, each one a piece of my courage made tangible. I paced the floor, rehearsing silently. You can do this. You're ready. When dawn broke, I carried everything to the market. My heart pounded as I set up the small stall, arranging lemon cakes, cookies, and bread in neat rows. The morning air was crisp, filled with the sounds of vendors greeting one another and stalls coming to life. And then the first customer approached. A young woman stopped, eyed the cakes, and smiled. "These look wonderful," she said. I held my breath as she bought a slice. She took a bite right there, her eyes widening with delight. "This is amazing. I'll be back for more." Something inside me shifted at that moment. It wasn't about the money or the sale. It was about being seen, truly seen, not as the broken girl left behind by her family, but as a woman who had created something beautiful from her own hands. That day, I sold nearly everything I had baked. By sunset, as I packed up my empty boxes, exhaustion washed over me. But it was a sweet exhaustion, filled with pride. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was building. And as I walked home, the flyer no longer taunted me. It had become a promise fulfilled, a door I had dared to open. Success, I quickly learned, carried its own kind of weight. After that first market, people began asking if I'd be back the next week, if I took orders, if I had a business card. Their questions thrilled me, but also left me breathless. I wasn't sure I was ready to be more than the girl with a small stall of cakes. At home, my apartment no longer looked like a place to live, but a bakery in disguise. Flour dust clung to every surface, stacks of boxes crowded the hallway, and the oven rarely cooled. Neighbors teased that they could track my schedule by the smell drifting under their doors. I smiled, but underneath, I worried. Was this sustainable? Could I really keep it going? The second market didn't go as smoothly as the first. A heavy rain fell, soaking the streets. My stall leaked, the boxes grew damp, and fewer customers came. By midday, I sat behind the table, watching the rain blur the colorful stalls around me. Unsold loaves still stacked high. Doubt gnawed at me again. Maybe the first week was luck, not proof of my talent. That night, I slumped into my chair, staring at the ruined boxes. Tears welled up, but this time they didn't feel like defeat. Instead, they felt like fuel, a stubborn refusal to let one bad day erase the hope I had fought so hard to find. I promised myself I'd try again, but smarter this time. Over the following weeks, I learned to adapt. I invested in a sturdier canopy, experimented with recipes that could withstand the weather, and found ways to decorate my stall with small touches of warmth. Fresh flowers in jars, hand-drawn chalkboard signs. Each adjustment made me feel not just like a baker, but like an entrepreneur, someone who could shape her own path. The real test came when I received an email from the market organizers, an upcoming food fair, larger than anything I had done before, with hundreds of visitors expected. My hands trembled as I read it. The thought of being surrounded by seasoned professionals terrified me, but the opportunity was too big to ignore. Preparation consumed me. I spent late nights sketching display ideas, testing recipes, and calculating how much I could realistically produce. Friends offered to help, neighbors volunteered to carry boxes,
and for the first time, I didn't feel entirely alone in my journey. Still, I couldn't silence the voice inside me that whispered, "What if you fail in front of everyone?" The morning of the fair, the venue buzzed with energy. Rows of polished stalls stretched across the square, each one gleaming with professional signs and dazzling displays. My stall looked modest in comparison, but it was mine. Jars of flowers, neatly wrapped cakes, and my nervous smile behind it all. At first, customers walked past, lured by bigger, flashier booths. My heart sank. I stood straighter, trying to exude confidence I didn't feel, and then an older couple stopped, sampled a lemon loaf, and bought two. Minutes later, a group of friends tried my cookies and laughed with delight. Slowly, people began to gather. By midday, my stall was crowded. Compliments poured in, children tugged at their parents to buy more, and I found myself laughing, explaining recipes, even writing down my name for future orders. Somewhere in the noise and bustle, I realized the truth. I wasn't just surviving the fair, I was shining. As the sun dipped and I packed up my nearly empty boxes, exhaustion swept over me. But beneath it, pride glowed fiercely. I had faced the storm, literally and figuratively, and discovered that I was stronger than the doubts that once caged me. Walking home that evening, I felt it clearly. This was no longer just a hobby. It was becoming my future. The food fair changed everything. After that day, orders began to trickle in through emails and handwritten notes slipped into boxes. Some were small, birthday cakes, trays of cookies, but others were larger, catering events I never imagined I could handle. Each message lit a spark of excitement, but also a wave of panic. Could I keep up? Could I deliver without failing? My kitchen became a battlefield of bowls, trays, and flour clouds. I woke before dawn, baked until my wrists ached, and went to bed long after midnight. For weeks, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. But even in the fatigue, I felt alive. This was mine. Still, cracks began to show. Deliveries ran late. A batch of brownies burned when I fell asleep at the counter. Once I rushed so much that I left sugar out of an entire tray of muffins. The customer returned them, polite but disappointed. I smiled, apologized, and offered a replacement. But inside, shame burned. The little voice of doubt whispered again, "You're not good enough. You're just pretending." One evening, overwhelmed and close to tears, I called Emma, my childhood friend. She arrived within the hour, found me sitting on the floor of my flower-streaked kitchen, surrounded by ruined pastries. Without judgment, she rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair, and started cleaning. "Sophie, you can't do this alone anymore." Her words echoed long after she left. She was right. If this was to become a real business, I had to treat it like one. That meant planning, organizing, and, hardest of all, asking for help. The next week, I created my first official menu, printed simple flyers, and bought a small planner to schedule orders. Emma volunteered to help with deliveries on weekends. Another neighbor, delighted by the smell of constant baking, offered to design a basic logo in exchange for a basket of cookies. Piece by piece, Sophie's kitchen began to take shape. But success didn't erase the challenges. There were days I doubted myself more fiercely than ever. One afternoon, delivering a wedding cake, I hit a pothole and watched the delicate frosting slide into ruin. I stood frozen in the street, tears welling, until the bride, unbelievably kind, patted my arm and said, "It's still the sweetest thing here." Her smile reminded me that mistakes didn't define me. Getting back up did. With each stumble, I grew steadier. I learned to laugh at small failures, to embrace them as part of the journey. I discovered the strength of community, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who cheered me on. And most of all, I began to see myself differently, not as the broken girl who once lost everything, but as a woman building something entirely her own.
One night, after finishing a long order, I sat at the kitchen table with Emma. Boxes of pastries lined the counter, and the warm smell of cinnamon lingered in the air. "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked, sipping tea. I shook my head, exhausted. "Sophie, you've built a business. From nothing, from ashes." Her words landed deep in my heart. I looked around my cluttered, cozy kitchen, the scattered tools, the messy counters, and the stacks of orders waiting to be delivered. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe it. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was the beginning of a life I had never dared to dream of.
Growth came slowly, like bread rising in the oven, almost invisible at first, until one day you noticed it had doubled in size. By the end of that year, Sophie's kitchen was no longer a secret tucked inside my small apartment. Word of mouth had carried me farther than I ever thought possible. I received messages from people I had never met, asking if I could make cakes for their families, cookies for their businesses, or bread for their cafes. With each order, my confidence grew. Yet with growth came pressure. My apartment kitchen, once charmingly chaotic, began to feel suffocating. Counters were always buried in mixing bowls, trays stacked dangerously high, and I often had to choose between storing flour or milk in the tiny refrigerator. I laughed about it with Emma, but inside I knew the truth. I had outgrown my space. The idea of moving terrified me. Renting a commercial kitchen felt like stepping into a world I didn't belong to. The world of real bakers, professionals who had studied and trained. Who was I compared to them? Just a woman who had once lost everything and stumbled into baking as a lifeline. But opportunities don't wait forever. One day I received an email from a small local cafe. They loved my pastries and wanted to feature them regularly on their menu. It was the kind of chance that could change everything, if I was brave enough to take it. That night, I barely slept. I paced my apartment, weighing every fear. What if I failed? What if people stopped ordering once I was in a cafe? What if this was as far as I was meant to go? But underneath the fear was a steadier, quieter truth. What if I succeeded? With Emma's encouragement, I signed the agreement. For the first time, my pastries would sit in a cafe for strangers to enjoy. The morning of the delivery, I woke before sunrise, nerves shaking my hands as I arranged boxes of croissants and cinnamon rolls. As I walked into the cafe, the warm smell of coffee mixed with the sugar and butter I had carried in. Seeing my pastries lined up in their glass case was surreal, as if my private little world had finally stepped into the light. Customers bought them. Smiles spread, compliments reached my ears secondhand, and each one felt like a spark igniting my chest. My work wasn't just surviving in the shadows anymore. It was out there, bringing joy to people I would never meet. Of course, it wasn't seamless. The cafe's schedule was relentless. They needed consistency, punctuality, and volume. I stumbled plenty. Late deliveries, uneven batches, sleepless nights. There were mornings I cried in the car before unloading boxes, convinced I couldn't keep up. Yet, every time I pushed through, I found myself a little stronger, a little steadier. One evening, Emma and I walked past the cafe after closing. Through the glass, I saw a young woman seated at a corner table, finishing one of my croissants with a smile that lit her whole face. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know the story behind the pastry. But in that moment, it hit me. This was the reason. All the tears, all the late nights, all the doubt. It was for moments like this. To create something that could bring someone else even a fragment of joy. Standing there, hand pressed against the glass, I whispered to myself, "This is real." And for the first time, I truly believed it. The cafe partnership was only the beginning. What I thought would be a small step turned into a floodgate.
Customers began asking where else they could buy my pastries, if I taught classes, if I had a shop of my own. Each question tugged at the corners of my dream, a dream I hadn't dared to voice until now: owning a bakery. For months, the idea haunted me. It felt impossible, the kind of thing people like me didn't get to have. Rent was high, equipment expensive, and the fear of failure loomed larger than ever. But with every tray I pulled from the oven and with every smile I saw on a stranger's face, the dream grew stronger. Emma was the first to push me. "Why not you?" she asked one night over tea, her eyes steady on mine. "You've already built something from nothing. This is just the next step." So I started looking. Small spaces, forgotten corners of the city that smelled like possibility. Most were far out of reach, either too costly or too broken down. But one morning, I stumbled across a little storefront, narrow but with large windows that spilled golden light onto the street. The walls were chipped, the floor creaked, but when I stepped inside, I could almost smell fresh bread in the air. My heart whispered, "This is the one." The months that followed were grueling. Permits, savings, loans, sleepless nights. I painted walls, scrubbed floors, and carried boxes heavier than I thought I could lift. There were moments when I nearly gave up, when the oven broke, when money ran thin, when exhaustion had me crying on the floor. But every setback became fuel. I wasn't just building a bakery, I was building myself. Finally, opening day arrived. I barely slept the night before, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, imagining an empty shop. What if no one came? What if it was all for nothing? But that morning, as I unlocked the door to Heart and Hearth Bakery, a line of people stretched down the street. Friends, neighbors, strangers who had followed my journey online, all waiting to taste a piece of my dream. The smell of warm bread and cinnamon filled the air. Children pressed their noses to the glass, couples laughed over steaming mugs of coffee, and my shelves emptied faster than I could restock them. Somewhere in the chaos, I caught sight of Emma, tears glistening as she clapped from the back of the crowd. By closing time, I stood in the middle of the bakery, the floor dusted with flour, my body aching but my heart soaring. This space, once an empty shell, now pulsed with life, my life. That night, after the last customer left, I turned off the lights and sat by the window, looking out at the street. My reflection stared back at me, but she was not the same woman who had once been betrayed, abandoned, and left broken. She was someone who had taken those scars and turned them into stars, into something that lit the way not just for herself, but for others too. I whispered into the quiet, "I'm home." And for the first time in my life, I knew it was true.